So, good day class. So, for today's topic, we'll discuss Chapter 1, Liabilities. Okay, so my reference for this discussion is Intermediate Accounting, Volume 2, 2020 edition by Conrado VALIX PERALTA and Christian Aris VALIX. Okay, for the course outcomes, at the end of this topic, you're expected to understand the concept of liabilities, describe the nature and type of current and non-current liabilities, know the measurement of current and non-current liabilities, explain issue of long-term debt falling due within 1 year, explain the issue of breach of covenant attached to a long-term debt, and describe formulas in computing bonus to officers and employees. Okay, first, concept of liabilities. So according to the revised conceptual framework of March 2018, it provides a definition of liability. So this is one of the updates with the revised conceptual framework issued last March 2018. So liabilities, so this is the new definition of liabilities. So these are present obligations of an entity to transfer an economic resource as a result of past events. So based on the definition, there are three essential characteristics, diba, in order for us to identify a liability. So first characteristic is, essential characteristic is present obligation. So present siya, so present obligation. So entity has no practical ability to avoid the duty or responsibility. Therefore, diba, nanay existing, nanay present obligation, that the entity, they don't have the ability to avoid the duty or the responsibility. So, obliged sila, okay, to comply or to settle the obligation. And this present obligation may be legal or constructive obligation. Okay, when we say legal obligation, okay, so that is legally enforceable as a consequence of binding contract or statutory requirement. Okay, while we say constructive obligation, so it also gives rise to liabilities by reason of normal business practice, custom, and a desire to maintain good business relations or act in an equitable manner. Okay, example of legal, di ba, based on contract, like purchase of goods, di ba, on account, di ba, that is legal. So you enter into a contract of sale, di ba, inana siya. And example of constructive obligation, di ba, that is by reason of normal business practice. Actually, example of constructive obligation is the warranty liability. Why? Di ba? Because normal for a company na nag-provide sila o warranty, especially ka ng mga appliances. So that's normal practice of the company. Okay. Also, another example is kaning mga mining companies, di ba? Tapos, there's one time na because of the mining activities, ang river, for example, na contaminated, di ba? Because of the mining activity, so na-contaminate ang river. So, because of the contamination, daghang tao ang affected, di ba? So, within the area. So, although there's no contract between the mining company and the katong mga settlers dito or even government agencies na in case inana mahitabo kinahanglan sila magbayad, but based on practice, if nay mga inana mahitabo, nagabayad yun ang company, ang mining company. So therefore, even walay legal or contract between the mining company and the government or even the settlers within the area, but still they are constructively obligated to pay for the damages that they have caused, okay, to the environment. So that's the first essential characteristic. So dapat na present obligation. Second is you have transfer of an economic resource. Therefore, transfer of economic resource. So when there is payment of money, transfer of non-cash asset, and or performance of services to settle the obligation, then there is a liability. So there is liability if there is a transfer of an economic resource. When you say economic resource, those are assets of the entity. So it may be payment of money, payment of cash, or transfer of another non-cash asset, or by performing performance of services, di ba, to settle the obligation. So dapat ang liability na ay present obligation, then there's a transfer of economic resource or na ay outflow sa imong asset. Okay, and last is past event. So, what do you mean past event? So, one of the essential characteristic is past event. So, obligation must arise from past transaction or event. So, this is the obligating event. Because of this obligating event, because of this past event, na-create ang present obligation, and because of the present obligation, the entity needs to transfer an economic resource to settle the obligation. Okay. Example ani, di ba? We need to identify if the transaction na by liability in that certain transaction. Example, di ba? Purchase of goods on account basis, di ba? The obligating event there is the purchase of goods, di ba? By purchasing the goods, na-create ang present obligation that you need to pay the supplier, di ba? Within the agreed terms, di ba ninyo? That is legal, di ba? That is contract. So therefore, the obligating event is the purchase of goods. By purchasing the goods, you have the present obligation to pay, or you have a present obligation to the supplier. Then, at a later date, you need to transfer an economic resource by payment of your liability, by payment of money or payment of cash for that present obligation. So, mo rin yung kinahanglan i-identify, di ba? Liability ba siya? So, dapat na ang past event, na ang present obligation, na ang transfer of an economic resource. If naikulang dra sila, then the item, the transaction, dili sa liability. Okay. Another, isa ka example aning kanang dili sa liability is kanang issuance of, di ba, shares dividend. Di ba? Declaration of share dividend. Why, di ba? Nag-declare ka og share dividend, although we use the dividend share dividend payable account, but the question is unsa imong gi-transfer, di ba? Shares ang imong gi-transfer. Therefore, dili wala ka nagbayad og money, wala ka nag-transfer of another non-cash asset, at the same time wala ka nag-perform og services. But ang imong gi-transfer is an equity account. Therefore, the declaration of share dividend is not a liability account. Diba? Does not arise to a liability account. Why? Although na ay past event the declaration, tapos you have the obligation to give shares. But the transfer of economic resource, dili sa money, dili sa non-cash asset, dili po sa performance of services to settle the obligation, but issuance of shares. The share account is not an asset account, that is an equity account. Okay, so that is an example. So, examples of liabilities. What are the examples of liability? So, you have accounts payable to suppliers. Okay, you have, for the purchases of goods, you have amount withheld from employees for taxes and for contributions to the SSS, katong PhilHealth, Pag-ibig. So, that's appeal sa dira. Okay, so mga withholding taxes. Next, accruals for salaries, interest, rent, taxes, product warranties, profit sharing bonus. So, di ba, accrued expenses. So, di ba, already incurred but not yet paid. So, that's why payable siya. Okay, cash dividend declared but not paid. So, take note ha, cash dividend lang ang considered as liability. But not, wala pa nabayaran, di ba? Unpaid pa sa declaration pa lang. There's no payment yet. Deposits and advances from customers. So, mo ni sa example, ani, kanang example na kay tindahan tapos na ay nagpalit og Coke sa imo, di ba? Na soft drinks nagpalit tapos walay dala botelya, di ba? Pag-deposit lang og 6 pesos per bottle, di ba? Na siya. So pwede na siya deposits and advances. Advances pod gibayaran ka una ni customer. Di ba? Nagbayad sa una, advance payment siya sa imo before nimo gatagan og goods or before ka nagperform og services. Okay, debt obligations for borrowed funds. So, siyempre, nangutang ka, you have the notes payable, mortgages, and bonds payable. Income tax payable, di ba? So, this is your liability to the BIR. And unearned revenue. So, these are revenues, di ba, na nadawat na nimo ang bayad from the customer, but wala pa nimo na perform ang service or even wala pa nimo na deliver ang goods, for example. Ano siya? Okay, so before we proceed, let's have first an example with this transaction. Kaning si amounts withheld from employees and taxes for contribution. This is applicable for payroll taxes. this is very important that you need to discuss because this is very applicable in your future workplace. So this is very basic in the workplace, especially if you're assigned in the payroll department, di ba? Okay, so discuss lang nato gamay para napod mo yung background ani. Di mo maglisod pag start na ninyo sa actual practice. Tapos combination with accruals of salaries. Okay, this is applicable for accrued salaries man siya. Okay. So this is the problem. So payroll taxes, accrued salaries. So an entity provided or no, reported the following provided the following payroll of employees for the month. Okay, so example, this is an actual example. So tama ang computation ana sa income tax, SSS, PhilHealth Pag-ibig based on katong tables, di ba? Naman tayo table sa punte rate. Okay, so isa lang isa ka employees di ay employees. So isa lang ka employees, iyang monthly salary gross pay niya is 25,000. Okay, nasa 25,000. Okay, 25,000. Medyo dako-dako sa sweldo. Okay, and kana nga bracket taxable na siya. So sa iyang 25,000, kita as employer ang company nasa employees contribution sa SSS. So this is mandatory deductions, di ba? Kinahanglan sa i-deduct, kinahanglan ta mag-contribute ani sa employee. These are mandatory deductions, di ba? Plus nasa deduction for PhilHealth, tapos nasa deduction for Pag-ibig. Okay. So based on this amount, di ba? Ang iyang net income, iyang net income is taxable siya. So based on the compensation income tax nga table, withholding table, so mo na ang iyang withholding tax. So 578. Therefore, ang mabili na lang kang employee is only 23,147. So mo na lang yung net pay, mo yung take home pay, di ba? But aside from the employee's contribution to SSS, PhilHealth Pag-ibig, si employer na pud say contribution. So this is also mandatory for the employer. So the employer is required to contribute for SSS, PhilHealth and Pag-ibig. So aside from the employee share, so si employer na siya ay 1,630 based on the table. So ang pag-compute lang ani sa employer's contribution, di ba SSS ni employee 800 times 2 lang, that's 1,600, tapos 30 pesos na additional nga 30 pesos ana for the employer. Okay, pero depende na siya sa bracket ha, so dili always 30 pesos. Okay, sa PhilHealth po, that's 3% of the gross pay, so that's 25,000 times 0.03. So, 750 siya, pero bahino na ni employee o ni employer. So, that's why 375 pod kang employer. Okay, si Pag-ibig, same, equal amount siya, 100, 100. Okay, how do we account for this transaction? So, how do we account for this transaction? Di ba nga na-appeal man sa liability? Okay, so let's prepare a journal entry so that we could see, di ba, unsa effect niya sa liabilities. So, by the way, this month is for December, ha? For December sa end of the month para makakompute tag liability account. So, syempre, mag-payroll every katapusan, di ba? So, usay gani mo lapas pa, di ba? Or first day next month, di ba, ana siya. Or, depende sa company on silang practice. So, this is the entry. Entry to record the gross payroll. Okay, so you have 25,000 salaries expense at gross amount. This is at gross. Okay, gross amount. Tapos, withholding tax payable, di ba? Because nag-withhold ta og 578, so naatay liability. Kinsa na to nga liability ni? So, ato ning i-remit kang BIR. So, we have a liability account kang BIR. Napunay deadline si BIR, kanos ani mo i-remit ang withholding ni mo taxes. So, therefore, nanatay liability account daan dire. So, that's 578. At the same time, siyempre, withholding agent lang punta ni SSS, ni PhilHealth, ni Pag-ibig, kinal na to ni i-remit sa ila. Diba? I-limit na to ning tulo. So, that's why napuntay i-remit to nun, diba, nga payroll taxes payable, that's 1,275. That's a total na sa tulo. The mandatory deductions. So, kani, employee share lang ni, diba? So, kita lang nagkuha kang employee, kita ang mo remit, si employer mo remit ana sa mga respective agencies. Then, ang net payroll niya, syempre, December at the end of the month, wala pa ta nagbayad, nag-compute lang ta daan, o pa nabayaran. So that's why na accrued salaries payable. So therefore, ang liability account na to ani, natay withholding tax payable, natay payroll taxes payable, na puti accrued salaries payable. How do we account the employer's contribution? Okay, so let's prepare entry. So entry to record the employer's contribution. So on the part of the employer, expense. Okay, they recognize this contribution of employer as payroll taxes expense. So it's an expense account. So that's 2,105. That total anintolo. Diba? Total anintolo. And at the same time, they need to remit this to the respective agencies. So that's why naka-payable account siya because i-remit ni kang SSS kang PhilHealth Pag-ibig. So that's payroll taxes payable to 105. So this is an example ato itong withholding of tax, tapos remittance sa SSS, PhilHealth, and Pag-ibig. So datay liability account dire sa withholding, liability account sa payroll, accrued salaries payable, then employer's contribution, naka-liability account siya, then expense account. You need to know these entries because it is really basic in the actual practice. So, ako lang sa itulodaan diri sa inyo para pag abot ninyo pohon sa inyong workplace, di na mo kayo makuratan, di ba ani siya. But take note na ano yung mga tables sa kanang mga contribution. So, you need to see the tables. Okay. So, nature and type of liabilities. So, we have, di ba, liabilities is classified as current liabilities and non-current liabilities. Okay, so current liability. So PAS 1, according to PAS 1, paragraph 69, provides that an entity shall classify a liability as current when the entity expects to settle the liability within the entity's operating cycle. Take note that if within the entity's operating cycle or normal operating cycle, the liability is classified as current. So it does not mean nga operating cycle within 12 months na siya. Diba? Kay depende man sa uban companies, diba? For them, this transaction, part silang normal operating cycle, but it will last for 2 years, for more than 1 year. But still, the liability is considered as current. Kumbaga, isettle nila ang liability for 2 years or for 1 year and a half, diba? Na siya, but that's part of their normal operating cycle. So still, it's a current liability because it's part of the entity's normal operating cycle. Okay, take note of that. Basta part sa normal operating cycle, current yun na ang classification niya. Sir, if silent ang problem, what do you mean by operating cycle? That is at least 12 months. Okay, so if wala, so at least 12 months. Operating cycle, at least 12 months. Okay. So, next is the entity holds liability primarily for purpose of trading. So, take note of this pod, you incur the liability for purpose of trading. If for trading siya, automatic, the classification is current liability. Okay, take note of this mga terms pag part sa normal operating cycle, pag naka-trading sa automatic, that's current liability. And next is the liability is due to be settled within 12 months after the reporting period. Take note to be settled within 12 months after the reporting period. So, kung bayaran siya next year, example, itong reporting date is December 31 to 2020, bayaran siya ang liability on June 30, 2021, although nilapas sa reporting period but to be settled sa within 12 months after the reporting period, still the liability is current. Okay, again, due to be settled within 12 months after the reporting period. If bayaran sa within 12 months after the reporting period, the liability is current liability. Next, the entity does not, take note of this, does not have an unconditional right to defer settlement of the liability for at least 12 months after the reporting period. Si pasabot ani. Walay right si entity to defer. Kumbaga, i-delay, i-adjust niya ang payment sa iyang liability. Dapat wala siya right to defer. Wala siya right dapat to defer the settlement. Kumbaga, i-delay or i-change ang term, di ba? sa pag-settle sa liability. So those are the, kumbaga, criteria to be classified as current liability. How about non-current liability? So actually, the term non-current liabilities is a residual definition. So if you say residual definition, kung wala sa na-under there sa current liability, then consider the liability is a non-current liability. So all liabilities not classified as current are classified as non-current liability. So basically, these are the examples of non-current liability. So you have non-current portion of long-term debt, finance lease liability, deferred tax liability, long-term obligations to officers, long-term deferred revenue. So actually, we will discuss this on the next chapters. Okay. So how do we measure liabilities? So conceptually, all liabilities are initially measured at present value and subsequently measured at amortized cost. So conceptually, all liabilities initial measurement at present value, subsequently measured at amortized cost. Okay. But there are some kaning kalahian, di ba? So on how are we going to account, di ba? Okay, so how do we measure a current liability? So actually, although conceptually at present value initial measurement, subsequently at amortized cost, but current liabilities in practice, okay, so are not discounted anymore. So the current liabilities or short-term obligations are not discounted anymore. Okay, why di na sa discount? Why we don't measure it at present value? 'Di ba? Because padayon sa natin, not discounted anymore but measured, recorded, and reported at face value. So take note that current liabilities is measured at face value. Okay, current liabilities or short-term obligations. Okay, why they are not discounted anymore, di ba? Nganong di naman ta mo compute og present value? Because if i-discount nato ang short-term liabilities or current liabilities, okay, there's no significant difference between the face value and the present value. Therefore, the difference of discounting the short-term or the current liability is not material, not significant. So that's why current liabilities in practice, it is recorded or measured at face value. Take note of face value, face amount. How about non-current liabilities? So we have also criteria here, measurement criteria for non-current liabilities. So if the non-current liabilities is a bonds payable, okay, so the initial measurement, so applicable to itong conceptually measurement. So initial measurement is at present value and the subsequent measurement is at amortized cost. Okay, this will be discussed on the succeeding chapters. But how about note payable, di ba? So, note payable na long term, di ba? So, how are we going to measure a note payable initially and subsequently? So, magmatter siya if the note payable is non-interest bearing or interest bearing. Okay, if the note payable is non-interest bearing, the initial measurement is at present value. And the subsequent measurement is at amortized cost. Take note of this. Pag non-interest bearing, ang note payable, initial measurement, present value, subsequent measurement at amortized cost. How about interest bearing note payable? What if interest bearing siya? Okay, so interest bearing note payable is initially measured at face value and subsequently measured same at face value. Okay, so take note of this ha. Pag interest-bearing siya, ang note payable, initial measurement face value, subsequent measurement face value. But if non-interest-bearing, initial measurement at present value. Therefore, we compute for the present value, PV of 1, PV of ordinary annuity. So we need to compute or discount the note payable. Then, subsequent measurement at amortized cost. Normally, we use the effective interest method. That's according to the standard. So, if you use the amortized cost, use the effective interest method. Okay. So, how about long-term debt falling due within 1 year? So, long-term debt sa pero mudyo na sa within 1 year. Although 5 years yung original term, pero for this year, 1 year, within 1 year, mudyo na siya. So, mana ang pasabot anang long-term debt falling due within 1 year. So a liability which is due to be settled within 12 months after the reporting period is classified. So how are you going to classify if this is the case? So classified sa as current liabilities even if the original term was for a period longer than 12 months. Okay, mo ni akong gingon, di ba? 5 years siya ang iyang term, but for this year, on the 4th year, di ba, module na sa within 12 months, ka 5th year niya. Therefore, the liability is considered current na for the 4th year, di ba? Because to be settled sa within 12 months after the reporting period. And an agreement to refinance or to reschedule payment on a long-term basis is completed, take note of this, after the reporting period but before the financial statements are authorized for issue. So current liabilities siya, say agreement to refinance, di ba? Oh, so nagsabot si borrower og si lender nga pwede ko mohangyo nga di man ako kaya mabayaran, pwede ta mag-agree, pwede na to i-refinance na i-reschedule na to ang payment. So actually, pwede siya. But the question is, kanus amo nag-agree? Kanus amo nag-refinance? Okay, kanus nag-agree ang parties? So if the parties agreed to refinance the long-term debt after the reporting period and before the financial statements are authorized for issue, therefore, the long-term liability or long-term debt is classified as current liabilities. Again, kanus amo nag-agree, kanus amo nagsabot to refinance or to reschedule the payment after na nahuman na ang imong reporting date. But wala pa na authorized for issue ang FS nimo. Kumbaga wala pa gi-agree sa board nga pwede na sa for public purposes. So authorized for issue. Okay. So that is current liability. So kanus sa ma-classify as non-current liability. So however, if the refinancing daw, so if nag-agree mo nga i-refinance or to reschedule the payment na complete siya on or before the reporting period, the refinancing is an adjusting event. Therefore, if nag-agree mo on or before the reporting period nga i-refinance, i-reschedule ang payment sa long-term debt, then the liability or the long-term debt is classified as non-current liability. Second, if the entity has a discretion to refinance or roll over the obligation. Kumbaga, kita nga borrower, naatay right, nasa to ang discretion kung kanus ana to pwede sa bayaran, kanus ana to sa i-refinance, kanus ana to i-reschedule ang payment. If that's the case, if we have the discretion to reschedule or refinance the long-term debt, then the liability nga atong gi-refinance, gi-reschedule is considered as non-current, is classified as non-current liabilities. Okay. Last is if the entity has unconditional right. Diba? If the entity has unconditional right under the existing loan facility to defer settlement of liability. Take note kagaina under PAS 1, diba? Current liability siya if the entity has no unconditional right. Therefore, if naasa unconditional right, naasa right nga i-refinance, i-reschedule ang term sa long-term debt, then therefore, the liability is classified as non-current liability. So, balik tayo dito sa katong gi-provide sa standard kung kanus current ang liability. Gi-provide dito last item na dapat the entity has no unconditional right. But in this case, naasay unconditional right, di ba, to defer settlement of liability. Therefore, the long-term debt due within 1 year is classified as non-current liability. Okay, so ano siya? Para dili malibog, di ba? So drawing ta ani, di ba? So this murag timetable ni siya. So kani siya, this is the end of reporting period. Mo ni imong reporting date. This is your reporting date. Okay. And this is the date FS is authorized for issue. So mo ni nga date nga gi-approve sa board of directors. Okay, ang FS nga pwede na sa issue for public purposes. Okay. So kani siyempre before the reporting period. Diba? Before the reporting period. What if nag-agree mo, diba? Refinancing of long-term debt. nag-agree mo ni lender, nag-refinance mo, nag-agree mo between this date. 'Di ba? Between this date. Diri mo nagsabot nga, oy lender atong di man ko kabayad, pwede sabot tabi, pwede i-adjust nato, i-reschedule nato ang payment. Pero nagsabot mo within this period, 'di ba? Gikan diri sa end of reporting date tapos before aning reporting date. On or before the reporting date. So diri mo nagsabot. So unsay classification atong long-term debt nga inyong gi-refinance reschedule. So the classification is non-current asset. But if you agreed on the to refinance the long-term debt after, 'di ba, humana after na sa end of reporting period but before sa FS is authorized for issue, then the classification of the long-term debt because nag-agree mo between this period after the reporting date but before the FS is authorized for issue, then the liability is considered as current. Sorry for this asset ako nabutang. So this is liability. Same with this. So liability na siya ha. Okay, so I hope clear ni siya ha. Okay. Next. So breach of covenants. What do you mean by what do you mean by covenants? So covenants are often attached to borrowing agreements which represent undertakings by borrower. These are restrictions on the borrower as to undertaking further borrowings, paying dividends, maintaining specified level of working capital, and so forth. So, in short, covenants, mo ni siya ang agreement ninyo ni lender. Ng example, nangutang ka sa bank. Bank, mangutang ko. Si bank niyo sa nga, sige, pautangon ta ka, pero dapat dili ka magngutang sa lain. Because siyempre si bank maniguro na 'di ba dapat mabayaran ko nimo sa imong utang. So as part of the covenant nato, sabot nato restriction is dili ka pwede mangutang sa lain while nakay-utang sa ako. Just to ensure kang bank po, 'di ba, security purposes na mabayaran siya. Bawal pug ka magbayad og dividends. 'Di ba? Instead nga magbayad kag dividends, para makabayad jud ka sa amo, dili sa ka magbayad og dividends. Balag mag-declare lang kayo lang pagbayad. Tapos maintaining specified level of working capital. So dapat imong level sa imong working capital in ani, dapat liquid ka, dapat imong asset is 1:2. Ay tama ba? 2 basta ana siya. So liquid ang imong working capital or imong asset. Kay di ba sa part sa lender maniguro gid siya nga dapat mabayaran siya sa iyang gipautang. And what happen if these covenants are breached? 'Di ba? What if kita na nga nangutang, kita nga borrower, nagbayad tag dividends, wa nato na maintain ang working capital nga level nga kinahanglan ni bank or nangutang ta sa lain, 'di ba? So automatic these covenants are breached, what will happen to the liability? Unsay may tabo sa tong utang? Then the liability becomes payable in demand. Regardless of the term, the liability becomes payable in demand. Kumbaga, from time to time, pwede kolektahon ni bank ang imong utang, di ba? Oy, bayad na kay ni breach man ka, akong kolektahon tanan utang nimo karon. So inana may tabo. So now, how are we going to classify if the liability or the covenants of the liabilities are breached by the borrower? So basically, if payable in demand siya, automatic current liability jud siya, di ba? Because in demand, so pag manukot si bank, dapat bayad jud ka diretso because payable in demand naman imong utang because of the breach of contract or breach of the covenant. So actually, automatic the liability is classified as current liability. So such liability is classified as current even if the lender has agreed, but take note after the reporting period and before the statements are authorized for issue. Same application. Kumbaga, the breach nimo ang contract, 'di ba, within the year. 'Di ba? So since na breach nimo ang contract on that year, payable in demand na siya. So you classify the liability as current. So ano siya pasabot anang after the period. So pag human sa reporting date nimo, nagsabot mo ni bank nga sige, pangyoon ta ka tagan ta ka grace period. So, tagan ta ka grace period para makabayad ka sa ako. So naay palugit, di ba? Grace period naay allowance gihatag si bank. Pero nag-agree sila after na. Di ba? After na sila nag-agree. So therefore, because after na sila nag-agree, at the end of the year, because payable in demand ang liability nimo because you breached the covenant, automatic current liability siya because payable in demand. But pwede ba siya maklasify, sir, as non-current liability? Yes, pwede. However, the liability classified as non-current if the lender has agreed on or before the reporting period, a grace period ending at least 12 months after the date. So, sir, si pasabot ana. Okay, di ba? Example, within the year, ni-breach ka sa covenant. Automatic, the liability is payable in demand. But before nag-end ang year, nag-agree mo, di ba? Before nag-end ang year, or during the end of the reporting period, or before nag-end imong ang tuig, di ba? Imong calendar year, okay, nag-agree mo ni lender, nag-agree mo ni bank nga, sige, hatagan, bank, patagi kung kuan may chance, di ba, anak ka. Okay, sige, tagan ta ka grace period. Pero nag-agree mo on or before the reporting period, di ba? Reporting date. Before na human ang tuig, nag-agree na mo. So therefore, since nag-agree na mo, the debt is not payable in demand na. Why? Because na may grace period. 'Di ba? Na may grace period, dili kaniya pwede kolektahan within that grace period. So automatic, the liability is classified as non-current liability. If you agreed on or before the reporting period. Kay na-settle pa man ninyo before ka nag-report, 'di ba? So naka-agree pa man mo. So therefore, the liability is classified as non-current liability. Okay. Presentation of liabilities. How are we going to present the liabilities? So under paragraph 54 pass 1, as a minimum, the face of the statement of financial position shall include the following line items for current liabilities. So for current liabilities, this is the minimum requirement, di ba? This is the minimum presentation. So content in the financial position or statement of financial position. So you have first, you have trade and other payables. Current provisions, this will be discussed on the succeeding chapters. Short-term borrowings, current portion of long-term debt, then current tax liability. So this is the minimum, kumbaga, sulod sa imong liability under current liabilities. But you can expand, di ba natin ginatawag nga level 1 reporting, level 2 reporting, level 3 reporting, level 5 reporting. So depende na on how you're going to report your FS, di ba? Pwede na po din ani, tapos the details can be found in the notes to financial statement. Okay, how about non-current liability? So this includes katong na-present na ni Gaina, you have non-current portion of long-term debt. Di ba kabantay mo, the current portion of long-term debt. Okay, current portion of long-term debt dire non-current portion. Di ba? Because current siya if payable within 12 months after the reporting period. Naman tayo mga utang, di ba, nga kumbaga, example, serial bonds. Kumbaga, nagabayad ta og principal every year. Therefore, katong principal na imong bayaran na mag-due within 12 months, current portion na to siya. But katong lapas na within 12 months, okay, that is the non-current portion. So, finance lease liability, long-term deferred revenue, deferred tax liability, long-term obligations to officers. Okay, so that is how you're going to present the liabilities in the statement of financial position. Let's have a sample problem. Okay, so the question is what amount should be reported as current liabilities and non-current liabilities. So let's apply atong gidiscuss kagayin na. Okay, so a company provided the following information on December 31, 2018. This is your reporting date. Diba? At reporting date, end of the period. Okay, so based sa iyang balances, you have accounts payable net of creditors debit balances of 200,000. Okay. Accounts payable net of creditors debit balances of 200,000. So, si pasabutan ni? Si pasabutan ng creditors debit balances. Okay. So, yun na ni. Diba? Creditors debit balances. Diba? Sa T-account na to, creditor, so kita ang naiutang. So, that's accounts payable. This is the T-account for the creditors. Diba? Creditors. Okay. Diba normal balance ato accounts payable is credit. It is the normal balance. Diba? So, unsay nahitaboan ni? So, nagka-debit balance siya og 200. Diba? Kumbaga, buto lang na to abnormal balance siya. Unsay nahitabo? Unsay nahitaboan ni? Diba? Kung natay, this is the accounts payable, natay liability diri for example, 800, ano nagka-debit balance siya? Kaya ang atong gibayad, nagbayad ta og 1 million. Nagbayad tag 1 million lagi. Okay, so nagbayad tag 1 million. Atong utang is 800 ra, pero atong gibayad 1 million. So di ba sobra atong gibayad? That's why sa creditors nga ti account nagka-debit balance og 200,000. Unsay classification ng 200,000? Di ba sobra atong gibayad kang creditor? Oy, creditor, sobra akong bayad. Ibalik na sa ako, di ba? Ibalik na sa ako, creditor. Therefore, this 200,000 is considered as receivable account na to kang creditor. So question, liability ba na siya? Dili, di ba? This is an asset account. But unsa ang gibuhat? Net. Gi-minus nato sa 2 million ang 200,000. Di ba? So, gi-minus na to ang asset, di ba? According to the standard, dapat separate ang pag-present sa asset o sa liabilities. Therefore, dapat tula nato sa ginet. So, pasabot ka ng 2 million, nabawasan na nag 200 nga receivable account natong at 200,000. So, we need to add back the 200,000. Question, unsay classification ani? So, that's 2,200,000 na. So, di ba, accounts payable man, this is current liability. Okay, how about accrued expenses? Diba? Automatic, that's current liability. Bonds payable due December 31, 2020. Kano sa mag-due December 31, 2020. Okay, di ba? Para current sa non-current. Okay, so that is non-current. Di ba? Sobra sa 12 months, di ba? End 2018, pero 2020, so 24 months siya. So, di siya payable within 12 months. Due to be settled within 12 months, therefore, non-current liability siya. Okay, deferred tax liability. Deferred tax liability is non-current liability. Income tax payable, this is this is current, di ba? So, income tax payable, current siya. So, this is current. Cash dividend. Take note, cash dividend payable. Okay, current. Correct. Share. Share dividend. Diba? Share dividend payable. Diba? Isa ka essential characteristic, there is transfer of economic resource. When you say economic resource, transfer of asset. It's either cash, non-cash asset, or performance of services. Okay. But unsa atong gihatag dire, we issue shares, di ba? Which is an equity account. Therefore, we need to ignore this one. Okay, wala na, ignore. Okay, note payable 6% due March 1, 2019. Cover, di ba? Due within 12 months. It is long-term debt due within 12 months. Okay, note payable 8%, cover gapon due within 12 months, di ba? 12% note payable, covered gapon siya because due siya within 12 months. Okay, so the financial statements for 2018 were issued on March 31. So this is the time nga FS is authorized for issue, March 31, 2019. On December 31, 2018 daw, the 6% note payable, kanisi 6%, pili amount ani 1,500,000, was refinanced, so gi-refinance siya on a long-term basis. So again, di ba, current sa non-current. So we need to identify kanus sa na-refinance. Di ba, para maklasify sa as current and non-current. So kanus sa na-refinance on December 31, 2018. Therefore, the classification of this 6% note payable is non-current asset. Di ba? If refinance on or before reporting date, so the classification is non-current asset. Okay, next, how about the 8%? So, ingon sa dire, under the loan agreement for the 8% note payable, the entity has the discretion to refinance the obligation for at least 12 months after December 31, 2018. Take note, after lagi siya. Okay, but di ba, the entity has a discretion. Automatic, if the entity has a discretion to refinance the obligation, nasa right to refinance the obligation, okay, so automatic, the 8% note payable is classified as non-current asset because na ay discretion. Okay, last. So, on March 1, 2019, the entire 4 million balance of 12% note payable was refinanced, again, refinance through the issuance of long-term obligation payable in lump sum. Okay, refinance siya. Question, si classification niya, current, non-current. Okay, so we need to identify kanus asa refinance. So, when it is refinanced, so on March 1, 2019. Therefore, March 1, 2019, that is after the reporting period December 31, 2018, but before the date of issuance on March 31, 2019. Therefore, what is the classification of the liability? So, that is classified as current liability. Okay, so mana, di ba, na-compute na nato. So, pila ang atong current liability? So, that is 2 million plus 200 plus 800 plus 600,000 plus 4 million. So, our current liabilities is 8,700,000. How about non-current? So, you have non-current, you have 4,500,000. Okay, 4,500,000 plus 500, that's 5 million plus 1,5, 6.5 plus 1 million, that's 7,500,000. Okay. So aside from examples of liabilities, 'di ba? Part of the liability account is the deferred revenue. So deferred revenue or unearned revenue is income already received but not yet earned, 'di ba? So gibayaran ta daan before ta naka-render services or nagatag og goods, 'di ba? So bayad una before gamit, 'di ba? That is deferral or unearned revenue. So, deferred revenue can be classified as current or non-current liability. So, pwede sa current, pwede sa non-current liability. So, when it is classified as current liability, so if the deferred revenue is realizable within 1 year, examples are unearned interest income, di ba? So, every year, di ba, ang ma-realize man yun ang interest income every year. Di ba? Unearned rental income, if yearly sa nagabayad ka sa rentals, then unearned subscription. Okay. So, depende sa subscription. If nag-subscribe ka og accounting tawag ani software, di ba? Pwede na siya. Mabayaran nimo gibayaran ka una ni customer before nimo gipagamit ang system sa iya. Okay, how about non-current liability? If the deferred revenue is realizable more than 1 year. So, of course, diba, pag sobra sa 1 year ma-realize, and that is non-current liability. Examples of non-current liability, deferred revenue. So, you have unearned revenue from long-term service contracts and long-term leasehold advances. So, kanang for long-term na service contracts, like for the period of 3 years, di ba, money ang gibayaran ka daan, pero 3 years in yung contract. So, that unearned revenue is considered as non-current liability. So, ma-realize siya within 3 years. So, every year na ay ma-realize, di ba? But, long-term man siya, so it's still non-current liability ang imong reporting sa unearned revenue. We also have estimated liability. So, from the word itself, estimated, gina-estimate lang nimo, kumbaga, ang amount sa liability based on estimate. So, estimated liabilities are obligations which exist at the end of the reporting period although their amount is not definite. Diba? Kaya siya, sure ka nga mo exist siya at the end of the reporting period but wala ka kabalo pilang amount. Even wala ka kabalo kinsa ang payee, kinsa imong bayaran. Diba? Tapos wa po ka kabalo kung kanus-an imo bayaran. Pwede gani siya pod nga wa ka kabalo kanus-a siya bayaran, pilang amount sa imong bayaran o kinsa imong bayaran. Pwede na siya dili Basta importante na kay obligation, di ba, nang-exist. But in spite of the circumstances, the existence of the estimated liabilities is valid and unquestioned. Okay, so although that the amount is not definite, the payee, wala pa kailakinsa, at the same time, when are you going to pay the liability or the obligation, but valid, the existence of the liability is valid and unquestioned. So still, you need to recognize, you need to record the liability. Estimated liabilities are either current or non-current in nature. Examples of estimated liability, you have gift certificates, you have bonus, premium, awards, points, and warranties. And these examples, diba, will be discussed on the next chapters. So those are examples of estimated liability. Okay, so for gift certificates, so inani ang nature sa gift certificates. Okay, examples, si McDonald's, di ba? Na yung mga GC si McDonald's or siguro buta na to, Robinsons. Okay, when gift certificates are sold, so kung kita si Robinson atong gibaligya ang gift certificate sa customer, what is our entry? So magka-payable ta once we sell the gift certificates to the customers. So you record cash, syempre gibaligya nimo, then you credit gift certificate payable. So that's the time you recognize a liability account. Okay, what if gi-redeem ang gift certificates, di ba, ni customer? So pag redeem ato, that's the time you kumbaga settle the liability. So debit gift certificate payable, then also that's the time you recognize sales. Diba? Because naihalin, diba? Naihalin, ipalit siya sa department store, pero yung gibayad katong GC. So still it's a sale, diba? Nagka-sale ka once gigamit ang GC pag bayad sa transaction. Okay, that's gift certificates payable. We also have bonus, diba? Bonus computation. So I will not discuss, although medyo tricky ang formulas with the bonus, diba? So it's still a liability account, diba? Bonus ginatagan based on the performance of the key employees and officers, diba? So if nindot yung performance, we will give you a bonus. So again, sure ka maghatag ka og bonus pero wala ka kabalo pilang amount kinsa imong hatagan o kano saan mo bayaran. Diba? Kay mahibawaan nimo na siya pag nana ang result kumbaga sa katong basis nimo. Okay, so I will not discuss anymore the bonus computation because the computation, I know it was already included in your partnership accounting, di ba? It's the same application on computing katong before tax, after bonus, after tax, okay, before bonus, after tax, di ba? So, you are familiar with that already. So, our discussion will end here. Okay, so that's all for liabilities. Okay, thank you for listening.